The air in the studio crackled with tension as Stephen Colbert leaned forward, his trademark grin replaced by a steely gaze. Across from him sat Elon Musk, the tech mogul whose presence alone commanded attention. The audience, expecting the usual blend of wit and banter, shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Tonight's episode of the late-night talk show promised a deep dive into current events, but no one anticipated the storm brewing between host and guest. What could push these two, larger-than-life figures, to the brink? Why would a conversation meant to entertain spiral into chaos? And how far would it go before someone crossed a line? The segment began innocently enough. Colbert, ever the provocateur, opened with a question about the future of social media platforms, a topic Musk was no stranger to. His recent moves to reshape online discourse had sparked debates across the globe, and Colbert wasted no time poking at the heart of it. He framed his inquiry with a mix of humor and skepticism, probing whether these changes truly served the public or merely fed one man's ego. Musk, accustomed to scrutiny, responded with his usual blend of confidence and deflection. But there was an edge to his tone. The audience chuckled nervously, sensing the undercurrent of something sharper beneath the surface. As the discussion unfolded, Colbert pressed harder, steering the conversation toward the ethics of unchecked influence. He questioned the ripple effects of Musk's decisions, not just on technology, but on the fabric of society itself. What happens when one person holds so much sway over what billions see and think? Isn't there a responsibility to wield that power with care? Musk, however, saw no need to justify himself. He countered with a defense of free expression, arguing that chaos was a necessary price for truth to emerge. His words carried a weight that silenced the room, but Colbert wasn't ready to let it slide. The host's next move was bolder, almost accusatory. He brought up recent controversies surrounding misinformation, hinting that Musk's platforms had become battlegrounds for division. The implication hung heavy. Was Musk complicit in the erosion of trust? The audience leaned forward, caught between anticipation and unease. Musk's eyes narrowed, his posture stiffening as he absorbed the jab. For a moment it seemed he might brush it off with a quip, but instead he leaned into the challenge. His response was sharp, cutting through the studio's polished veneer with a precision that made even Colbert flinch. What had started as a sparring match was now a full-blown confrontation. The host, sensing the shift, doubled down, his questions growing more pointed. He wasn't just challenging Musk's ideas anymore, he was challenging the man himself. Musk, never one to back down, met each barb with a counterattack, his words laced with a mix of intellect and indignation. The audience, no longer laughing, watched as the line between debate and personal attack blurred. Something was building, something neither man could fully control. By the time the segment reached its peak, the studio felt like a pressure cooker. Colbert, perhaps sensing he'd gone too far, tried to pivot to lighter fare, but Musk wasn't having it. The mogul's patience, stretched thin, was on the verge of snapping. Every word from Colbert seemed to stoke the fire, and the audience could feel it. A reckoning was coming. What would it take to push Musk over the edge? And when he struck back, would Colbert be ready for the fallout? The answer loomed closer with every passing second, setting the stage for a clash that would leave everyone reeling. The studio's atmosphere had thickened, a palpable weight pressing down as Stephen Colbert's attempt to steer the conversation faltered. His pivot to lighter topics landed flat, the audience too gripped by the tension to buy the shift. Elon C. Musk, his face a mask of controlled intensity, wasn't ready to let the earlier exchange dissolve into late-night pleasantries. The mogul's gaze locked onto Colbert, and in that moment it was clear. The confrontation wasn't over. It was escalating, and the room braced for impact. Colbert, ever the showman, tried to regain control. He tossed out a question about innovation, hoping to nudge Musk toward familiar ground. But the tech titan wasn't interested in playing along. Instead, he turned the tables, questioning Colbert's motives in framing the earlier debate so aggressively. The accusation wasn't subtle, implying the host cared more about headlines than truth. The audience gasped softly, caught off guard by the directness. Colbert's smile tightened, a flicker of unease betraying his composure. Undeterred, the host pushed back, his tone sharp but measured. He defended his role as a provocateur, arguing that tough questions were the price of sitting in the guest chair. Yet beneath the polish, there was a hint of defensiveness, as if Musk's jab had hit closer to home than he'd admit. The exchange grew hotter, each man digging in, their words like sparks threatening to ignite something larger. The audience, now fully invested, hung on every syllable, sensing the fragility of the moment. Musk, seizing the momentum, leaned forward, his voice low but cutting. He challenged the very foundation of Colbert's platform, suggesting that late-night shows thrived on outrage rather than insight. It was a brutal critique, one that painted the host as a performer rather than a journalist. The room felt smaller, the air heavier, as Colbert absorbed the blow. For a split second, his confidence wavered, and the audience saw it, a crack in the armor of a man used to controlling the narrative. The host rallied quickly, his wit returning like a shield. He countered with a pointed remark about Musk's own flair for spectacle, implying the mogul was no stranger to chasing attention. The jab landed, earning a murmur of approval from the crowd, but it also pushed Musk further. The tech titan's demeanor shifted, his indignation giving way to something colder, more calculated. He wasn't just debating now. He was preparing to dismantle. As the segment careened toward chaos, the producers in the control booth exchanged frantic glances. This wasn't the polished sparring match they'd planned. It was raw, unscripted, and dangerously personal. Colbert, sensing the show slipping from his grasp, made a final attempt to rein it in, but Musk was done with restraint. The mogul's next move would be a verbal grenade, one that would shift the power dynamic entirely. The audience, riveted, could feel the ground shifting beneath them, waiting for the explosion that would redefine the night. The studio teetered on the edge of pandemonium as Elon Musk's calculated intensity bore down on Stephen Colbert. The mogul's last words lingered, a challenge that had stripped away the veneer of civility. The audience, no longer passive spectators, leaned into the moment, their collective breath held as they sensed the confrontation hurtling toward a breaking point. Colbert, his instincts as a host screaming to regain control, faced a choice: diffuse or ignite. He chose the latter, and the consequences would ripple through the night. With a glint of defiance, Colbert leaned into the fray, his voice laced with a mix of sarcasm and indignation. He accused Musk of dodging accountability, framing the mogul's critiques as a smokescreen for unchecked ambition. The jab was personal, designed to provoke, and it hit its mark. Musk's expression hardened, his eyes flashing with a fury that hadn't surfaced until now. The audience felt the shift, a visceral tightening of the air as the mogul prepared to unleash something unrestrained. What followed was a masterclass in controlled rage. Musk didn't shout, he didn't need to. His words, deliberate and razor-sharp, sliced through Colbert's armor with surgical precision. He turned the host's accusations back on him, questioning the integrity of a man who built a career on mockery while claiming moral high ground. The critique was devastating, exposing the contradictions in Colbert's public persona. The audience, torn between shock and awe, couldn't look away. Colbert, visibly rattled, struggled to mask the sting. His usual quick wit faltered, replaced by a defensive edge that only deepened the wound. He fired back, but his words lacked their earlier bite, sounding more like defiance than conviction. The power dynamic had shifted, and Musk seized it fully. With a calm that belied the storm, he delivered a line so cutting it silenced the room. A direct, unapologetic jab at Colbert's relevance in a world that no longer needed gatekeepers. The host's face flushed, betrayal and humiliation flickering in his eyes. The audience erupted in a mix of gasps and murmurs, the raw emotion of the moment spilling over. Producers scrambled, unsure whether to cut to commercial or let the chaos unfold. Colbert, cornered, made a snap decision that would define the night. His voice, trembling with barely contained anger, demanded Musk leave the set. It was a desperate move, one born of wounded pride rather than strategy, and it played directly into Musk's hands. As the mogul rose from his chair, the studio fell silent, every eye locked on him. He didn't storm off. He moved with a deliberate, calm that radiated authority. The audience, caught in the emotional undertow, felt the weight of what they'd witnessed. Colbert, left alone on the stage, faced a crowd that had seen him unravel. The night wasn't over, but the battle was, and Musk had drawn first blood. The silence in the studio was deafening as Elon Musk's figure receded from the stage, his deliberate strides echoing with a quiet triumph. Stephen Colbert stood alone, the spotlight unforgiving, his face a battlefield of emotions, anger, humiliation, and a dawning realization of the misstep he'd taken. The audience, still reeling from the confrontation, sat frozen, their murmurs swallowed by the weight of the moment. What had just happened wasn't just a talk show blunder. It was a public unraveling, and Colbert knew it. He tried to salvage the moment. With a forced chuckle, he addressed the crowd, framing the ejection as a bold stand against arrogance. But the words rang hollow. The audience, still processing Musk's devastating exit, wasn't buying the spin. Their applause, when it came, was tepid, more out of habit than conviction. Colbert's charm, usually his greatest weapon, felt like a dulled blade. Behind the scenes, producers scrambled to pivot, but the damage was done. The show had to go on, yet the host's heart wasn't in it. As the cameras rolled, Colbert transitioned to the next segment, but his delivery lacked its usual spark. His jokes landed flat, each one a reminder of the firestorm he'd ignited. Offstage, the crew whispered about the fallout. Would this moment haunt the show's reputation? Could Colbert recover from being so publicly outmaneuvered? The host, sensing the shift in the room, pushed through, but his mind was elsewhere, replaying Musk's words, each one a barb that had found its mark. Meanwhile, the audience's mood began to shift. Some felt a pang of sympathy for Colbert, recognizing the human cost of his gamble. Others, still buzzing from Musk's audacity, marveled at how he'd turned the tables. The divide was palpable, a microcosm of the broader debates the confrontation had unearthed. Social media, though unseen in the studio, was already ablaze, with clips of the argument spreading like wildfire. The world was watching, and Colbert's vulnerability was now public property. The host, aware of the stakes, steeled himself for the next act. He couldn't let the night end in defeat. Drawing on years of experience, he began to weave a narrative, not through humor, but through raw honesty. He acknowledged the intensity of the exchange, framing it as a clash of ideas rather than egos. It was a risky move, one that invited scrutiny, but it resonated with the crowd. Their attention sharpened, sensing a chance for redemption. As the segment closed, Colbert's voice steadied, his resolve hardening. He wasn't the same man who'd started the night, but he was adapting, learning from the bruises. The audience, drawn into his vulnerability, began to rally, their energy a lifeline. The stage was set for a comeback, but it would demand everything. The night had exposed him, but it wasn't over, not yet. Stephen Colbert stood at a crossroads as the studio's energy hung in the balance. The audience, still reeling from his raw admission of vulnerability, watched him with a mix of hope and expectation. The earlier clash with Elon Musk had left scars, exposing the host's limits in a way few had seen before. Yet in that exposure lay opportunity, and Colbert, ever the performer, began to carve a path toward redemption, one that demanded he confront the night's chaos head-on. He pivoted away from the safety of his usual playbook, choosing candor over polish. Addressing the audience directly, he spoke of the argument's intensity, not shying away from his role in its escalation. His voice carried a weight of accountability, acknowledging how quickly a debate could spiral into something personal. The crowd, sensing his sincerity, leaned in, their earlier judgment softening. It wasn't just a host saving face. It was a man owning his missteps under the glare of scrutiny. Colbert's words grew bolder, weaving the night's events into a broader reflection on the state of discourse. He didn't name Musk, but the mogul's presence lingered, a silent counterpoint to the host's evolving narrative. The audience responded, their applause building as they recognized the courage it took to dissect a public fumble live on air. Each sentence felt like a step toward reclaiming the stage, not through deflection, but through unflinching honesty. Behind the scenes, the crew felt the shift. Producers, braced for a ratings disaster, began to see a different story unfolding. Social media, a relentless judge, showed glimmers of praise amid the chaos, with some viewers lauding Colbert's willingness to bear his flaws. The divide remained. Musk's fans still claimed victory, but the host's gamble was resonating, pulling the room back to his side. The air, once thick with tension, now buzzed with possibility. As the segment unfolded, Colbert found his footing, his humor returning with a sharper edge. He didn't erase the earlier humiliation. Instead, he used it, crafting jokes that acknowledged the night's rawness while pointing to something larger. The audience laughed, not out of obligation, but because they felt part of the journey. Their energy fueled him, a reminder that the night could still end on his terms if he could sustain the momentum. The stage was set for a pivotal turn. Colbert knew the audience craved more than recovery. They wanted a reason to believe in him again. His next moves would need to balance vulnerability with strength, showing he could rise without pretending the fall never happened. The crowd, now invested, waited for what came next, their connection to him deeper for having seen him falter. Stephen Colbert stood at a crossroads as the studio's energy hung in the balance. The audience, still reeling from his raw admission of vulnerability, watched him with a mix of hope and expectation. The earlier clash with Elon Musk had left scars, exposing the host's limits in a way few had seen before. Yet in that exposure lay opportunity, and Colbert, ever the performer, began to carve a path toward redemption, one that demanded he confront the night's chaos head-on. He pivoted away from the safety of his usual playbook, choosing candor over polish. Addressing the audience directly, he spoke of the argument's intensity, not shying away from his role in its escalation. His voice carried a weight of accountability, acknowledging how quickly a debate could spiral into something personal. The crowd, sensing his sincerity, leaned in, their earlier judgment softening. It wasn't just a host saving face. It was a man owning his missteps under the glare of scrutiny. Colbert's words grew bolder, weaving the night's events into a broader reflection on the state of discourse. He didn't name Musk, but the mogul's presence lingered, a silent counterpoint to the host's evolving narrative. The audience responded, their applause building as they recognized the courage it took to dissect a public fumble live on air. Each sentence felt like a step toward reclaiming the stage, not through deflection, but through unflinching honesty. Behind the scenes, the crew felt the shift. Producers, braced for a ratings disaster, began to see a different story unfolding. Social media, a relentless judge, showed glimmers of praise amid the chaos, with some viewers lauding Colbert's willingness to bear his flaws. The divide remained. Musk's fans still claimed victory, but the host's gamble was resonating, pulling the room back to his side. The air, once thick with tension, now buzzed with possibility. As the segment unfolded, Colbert found his footing, his humor returning with a sharper edge. He didn't erase the earlier humiliation. Instead, he used it, crafting jokes that acknowledged the night's rawness while pointing to something larger. The audience laughed, not out of obligation, but because they felt part of the journey. Their energy fueled him, a reminder that the night could still end on his terms if he could sustain the momentum. The stage was set for a pivotal turn. Colbert knew the audience craved more than recovery. They wanted a reason to believe in him again. His next moves would need to balance vulnerability with strength, showing he could rise without pretending the fall never happened. The crowd, now invested, waited for what came next, their connection to him deeper for having seen him falter. Stephen Colbert's renewed command of the stage pulsed with an electric clarity, the audience now tethered to his every word. The vulnerability he'd shown had forged a bond, transforming their earlier doubts into unwavering support. The specter of Elon Musk's departure no longer dominated. Instead, it served as a catalyst for something greater. Colbert, sensing the moment's potential, prepared to close the night not just as a host, but as a figure who'd turned chaos into triumph. He leaned into the final segment with a quiet intensity, his voice steady and purposeful. Rather than dwell on the argument, he spoke to the power of resilience, framing the night as a microcosm of navigating a fractured world. His words carried a universal weight, resonating with anyone who'd ever stumbled under pressure. The audience, drawn into his orbit, nodded along, their applause swelling with a warmth that felt deeply personal. Colbert's humor, now a blade honed by the night's trials, cut through the tension with precision. He didn't mock Musk or revisit the ejection. Instead, he turned the lens inward, poking fun at his own tendency to push too far. Each laugh from the crowd was a release, a shared acknowledgement of human imperfection. The crew, watching from the wings, marveled at the transformation. What could have been a disaster had become a defining moment, one that would linger in the show's legacy. The segment built to a crescendo, each moment crafted to leave the audience uplifted. Colbert spoke of the value of tough conversations, not as battles to be won, but as bridges to understanding. His sincerity disarmed any lingering cynicism in the room, replacing it with a collective sense of possibility. Social media, still churning with takes, began to reflect a growing consensus. The host had not only survived but emerged stronger, his authenticity a beacon in a sea of noise. As the show drew to its close, Colbert stood taller, his presence filling the studio. He thanked the audience, not with his usual flourish, but with a quiet gratitude that felt earned. The crowd erupted, their ovation a testament to the journey they'd shared. There was no need for grand gestures or final jabs. The night had been its own resolution, a story of falling and rising told in real time. When the cameras stopped rolling, the studio buzzed with a rare energy. Colbert, though exhausted, carried a lightness he hadn't felt at the start. The audience filed out, their conversations alive with what they'd witnessed. A man who'd faced the fire and walked through it, not unscathed, but undeniably triumphant. The night belonged to him, and the story it told would echo far beyond the stage.